Hello and welcome. We are in the middle of the worst economic recession since the Great Depression crippled the world more than 100 years ago. How should the world respond to this economic virus? What's the best way of first ventilating the global economy and then nursing it back to health? I'm joined live and exclusive from Washington, D.C. by an Indian economic ace, global economic superstar, one of the world's leading policy gurus, Chief Economist of the International Monetary Fund, Dr. Gita Gopinath. Gita, welcome. What we're hoping to do is to draw on your global expertise, apply it in the Indian context, and hopefully lay out a prescription for the Indian economy to spring back to life. You've described the current situation as the great lockdown, and that's a term that's caught on. What, in your view, is the reason that this financial crisis is the worst we've seen for about 100 years? Why do we need to go back to the Great Depression to find something that comes close or can be a parallel?
So Rahul, this is a crisis like no other. If you look at the shock itself, so it's a pandemic, it's a virus pandemic, and it's having really large real effects on the global economy. So you typically think of a crisis that's triggered by, say, a collapse in housing prices or a bursting of a financial bubble. And the shock itself is significant, but it comes and it goes, and then it's the amplification. This time around, the shock is large. It involves people having to stay home, not be able to go to work. And it's many weeks and months of it, and there's tremendous uncertainty about what's going to come next. So the real consequences are just tremendous this time around, and you've seen that everywhere. It's also a truly global crisis, which means since the first time since the Great Depression, both emerging and developing economies and advanced economies are in recession, and this has not happened before. So I think the severity of the crisis is just tremendous, and that's why it surpasses the global financial crisis. And the last thing it goes back and compared it to the Great Depression, which of course was much more severe.
Continuing with the historical theme, what are the lessons past financial crises teach us which you believe are applicable in the current context, mistakes which were made earlier which should be avoided now, or lessons that were learned which can be applied now?
So I think what we've learned, and you can see that in the kinds of policy responses we're seeing around the world, which is that you need to respond very quickly to make sure that financial markets are not deeply disrupted, that there is sufficient liquidity in the system. And you've seen that if you compare, for instance, the US Fed's policy responses compared to how they responded at the time of the global financial crisis, this is much faster. Now, of course, part of that is because everybody has learned how to do it, and a lot more is being rolled out much more quickly. So I think that's one important lesson. And a lesson I think one has to keep in mind for the future is that during these times when you are providing all of the support and stimulus in the system, it's also important to keep track of the financial vulnerability that might be building up as you have a crisis where you end up with more non-performing loans. So both of those have to go together to make sure that once we're out of this pandemic phase, that we can have a smoother recovery.
I want to spend some time dealing with what the IMF is doing globally before I come to India. A few months ago, questions were being asked, op-eds were being written about the relevance and the utility of the IMF, since countries were no longer coming to the International Monetary Fund seeking bailouts. Now suddenly you've got 90 countries pleading with the IMF for financial helplines. Give our viewers a sense of what's happening globally and how deep the crisis you believe is outside of India.
So Rahul, that number right now is 100 and more actually that have approached the fund to talk about or to seek financial assistance. And that's never happened before. So that's the number is really unprecedented since the start of the fund. What we have done is to respond very quickly. We've had to increase access to rapid financing so that we can meet the demand of the large numbers that are coming at this point. So we expect that would be a demand of about $100 billion, and we are making sure that we're able to provide that immediately. We also have our $1 trillion capacity, which we are deploying for the benefit of members. Now, this is the time when we expect our membership to come to us because this is such an unprecedented crisis for no fault of countries, which is it's a completely exogenous shock, and they need rapid financing. So I think there are three big things that the international community needs to do for many developing economies around the world. One is concessional financing, the second is aid, and the third is debt relief. And the IMF, through its mandate, is providing concessional financing at a rapid pace and also providing debt service relief to its poorest members.
You know, I want to tell everyone who's plugged in right now, whether it's on television, whether you're on Facebook, on YouTube, on Instagram, on Zoom, you can send us your questions, and I will soon start taking up some of the questions our viewers are sending us and putting them to Dr. Gita Gopinath. Dr. Gopinath, we were already in a globalizing, deglobalizing world. How do you believe this pandemic will redefine the economic globalization project?
Rahul, I think there is a real concern about deglobalization. So the way, even in the run-up to this crisis, we saw a trend of countries becoming more protectionist. And with this crisis, of course, the health crisis has necessitated that international borders are closed in terms of travel for people. And because you cannot have workers going to factories, goods are not being produced, which means global supply chains are breaking down. But this is a part of the containment strategy, so this is to be expected now. But once we have passed this, it's very, very important that countries do not indulge in protectionist measures. So firstly, even now, it's very important for countries to refrain from putting, restrictions on exports of medical equipment or protection gear around the world. I think that really should be frowned upon. This has to be a moment of solidarity. This problem will not be solved unless the virus is contained everywhere in the world. Otherwise, it'll just keep coming back. And we know that the global supply chains are essential for productivity and around the world. And so if we have protectionist measures being undertaken and these global supply chains are more permanently broken down, then we're going to just make it that much harder to get the recovery that we are projecting for now for 2021.
But over the last several years, we already saw economic walls being built. The virus came largely to most countries from outside. Do you believe that this could trigger, even though you wouldn't want it, greater economic nationalism? Look within, turn your windows shut, close your doors, try and make your own economies self-reliant.
Again, like I said, that this is a concern, but on the other hand, I also think that this crisis is making very clear that international cooperation is absolutely essential. You can see that through announcements of the G20, the G7, what we're doing at the International Monetary Fund, that we're all in this together. And so if it turns out that we all go inwards, the countries start going inwards, and you end up with just a weaker outlook for the global economy, it does not help any country. Countries depend not just on demand at home, but on external demand. And if there is not a wholesome growth in the world, this would be a weak outlook going forward. So I believe there are risks to deglobalization, but I think there is still enough support, political support too, for ensuring that doesn't happen.
So we've dealt with the problem. I now want to see if you have a roadmap for the economy to bounce back. Just at this immediate moment, what is it that you believe governments in general and India in particular need to do to ventilate the economy? We're in a COVID-induced coma. What's the first thing we do to get the economic ventilator going?
So the first priority in dealing with this crisis is to deal with the health crisis. So, while we're in, this is a severe point in the pandemic around the world, countries are thinking about lifting containment measures and doing that gradually. I mean, India is also thinking about it. So it's very important that in this step, that this is done in a calibrated way. It will require testing to happen on a broad scale as much as is possible to make sure that you're not getting pockets of infection reappearing again. So again, on the health front, countries will have to continue to spend on healthcare facilities to strengthen the health infrastructure, especially developing countries who need to strengthen their healthcare infrastructure to make sure that if there is a second wave, at least there will not be tremendous stress on the health system. So you can restart activity, but if people fall sick, then at least you have the health system to take care of it. So that has to be the first priority. The second priority has to be to make sure that the people, the livelihoods, the firms that are directly impacted by this crisis get the help they need. And, we strongly support the actions being taken in India right now in terms of providing transfers, both in kind and cash transfers to low-income workers. I think that's absolutely essential. I think what the RBI is doing in terms of making sure that credit flows to small and medium enterprises to hold them up, I think is very important. So again, like I said, in this recovery phase, this will have to continue. Support for the economy in terms of medium, small enterprises, low-income households, this will have to continue, and to ensure that the financial market works well. Now, this will call for fiscal action, will call for fiscal spending, and it will call for big measures on the monetary policy front. So to make sure that in the next years to come, things play out well, it's very important, for instance, for monetary policy to keep a close eye on developments, what's happening in the financial system, to ensure that you're regulating, you're supervising, to see what kinds of vulnerabilities are building up, what's happening to asset quality. And the RBI has actually provided guidance on that, so that's a great step. Similarly, on the fiscal front, spending is being undertaken, but there has to be a lot of transparency and accountability so that when you come out on the other end of this crisis, you at least have a clear picture of what needs to be addressed.
But this crisis is so deep and so wide that the requirement for fiscal stimulus is in so many different quarters. Every sector of industry we've been speaking to pleading for fiscal stimulus and help. The poor people, we've got a situation in India where migrants in some pockets seem to be getting restive. We have to find ways of transferring cash into their accounts. GST collections are down because industries come to a halt. How do you think, in the immediate context, government revenue should be best spent?
This is a crisis that calls for strong government action. Like I said earlier on, it's an exogenous shock. And this requires support for people, for households, for firms that are being affected by it. This is a crisis that they did not create. So they require support for it. And the question is, how does one finance the spending that's needed? Of course, there's one piece which you redirect spending towards the pandemic crisis related needs, away from other spending that you might have done in the absence of this crisis. So there's one redirection that happens. But that will not be enough. You would also have to increase the scale of this spending. And that's happening around the world. I mean, I think all countries are in the same situation where they have to increase their fiscal spending that they have to do. And India has to do that too. So the question is, what comes next? Then do we just end up with this dire situation on the debt front? Now, for many countries, of course, we are projecting that growth will come back up in 2021. And so if interest rates remain low and you get a growth boost next year, then that will stabilize debt increase in countries. Now, again, this is not guaranteed. There is a lot of uncertainty. The recovery could be much weaker. There could be a much more longer-lasting pandemic. And in that case, one would have to revisit all of this. But you can definitely see a situation where there will be countries in the world who will continue to need concessional financing, who will continue to need debt relief and debt restructuring at the other end of this. But for now, you cannot have a situation where you let the economy collapse completely by not doing enough. Because if anything, you could end up with a much worse debt situation if that were to happen.
I'm curious to know, how is the IMF prioritizing all the competing requests that are coming in? You say now there are 100 plus countries. If everybody wants money, how are you prioritizing where to send that money, and how does that impact India in your view?
So Rahul, we have $1 trillion capacity, so we are well resourced at this point in time, and given the scale of requests that are coming in, we are still in a good position to meet all the demands. So I don't think, thankfully, we don't have to do the hard prioritizing here. The one, of course, one issue is that the IMF cannot lend to countries where their debt is unsustainable. I mean, that's just what the rules of the game are here. And this is a crisis where there will be countries whose debt become unsustainable, and we then have to work with them to figure out a way of how they can get other kinds of financing and how they can, it might involve some amount of debt restructuring, but how can they get to a point where the debt is more sustainable so that we can actually provide them more financing?
What kind of economic recovery are you modeling? Do you think this will be a V-shaped recovery? Is this more likely to be a U-shaped recovery? Is this more likely to be an L-shaped recovery? And why?
Rahul, it really doesn't fit any alphabet. I've got this question so many times that I've tried to see whether there is an alphabet that works well, and really doesn't. Firstly, there is a lot of heterogeneity across countries and what the recovery would look like. I think what is clear even in our baseline is that we have a deep contraction in 2020, and then we have a recovery in 2021, but that is a partial recovery, which means that even by the end of 2021, we expect the global economy to be below where it would have been in the absence of the virus. We're talking about a loss of about $9 trillion in terms of total output loss between 2020 and 2021. I mean, that's if you take the size of the Japanese economy and the German economy and you combine those, that's a bigger number than that. So we are talking about a slow recovery. I think the bigger concern is that suppose this pandemic spills over into the second half of this year, and then even into 2021, then we have a scenario where we are projecting global growth to be -6% in 2020 and close to 0% in 2021. So that would be the classic L-shaped, which is that there is really no or not much of a recovery. And that's when I think things will get even more difficult and complicated.
Dr. Gopinath, I want to now start taking some questions that are coming in. The first question comes in from Swapan Seth, who asks, and I'll quote what he says, in its latest World Economic Outlook, the IMF calls what's happening now the Great Lockdown. Martin Wolf, writing in the Financial Times, uses the phrase Great Shutdown. He asks, why do you believe China and India will still post a 1.9 and 1.2% growth? What is it about India and China, which is their secret sauce, which helps them grow at a time when virtually every other economy of the world will actually contract?
The first important thing is that China and India are economies whose potential growth are way higher than most other economies in the world. So we have potential growth for India at 6.5–7%, and we have for China at between 5.5% and 6%. So even when you have a severe reduction in that growth rate, it's difficult. You don't get to negative territory. While for most advanced economies of the world, we're talking about growth rates of lower than 2%, which is why they go very quickly into negative numbers. Now we have to. That said, I just want to point out also for India, which is that number we have of 1.9% is for the fiscal year. So it's fiscal 2021. So it spills over into the first quarter of 2021. If we were doing a calendar year-based number, that would be our projection for this calendar year is 0.5%. So these are some of the distinctions. I also, another point I would like to make is I think that in terms of the risks to our forecast, I would say that some of the biggest risks are on the downside for emerging and developing economies. And the reason for it is that while we've seen the severity of the pandemic in the US, Europe, following from China, we haven't seen that severity yet in many developing and emerging markets. And so while we've assumed in our forecast that things will be worse than what we're seeing on the ground right now, it's very hard for us to predict exactly how severe it will be. So I think there are serious downside risks.
There's been different forms of economic disruption that's played out for individuals, for corporates over the past few weeks. How do you see the new normal evolve? What's your view of what the new normal economy post this pandemic is likely to look like?
I mean, this crisis being so unique has affected firms in an incredibly unique way. So if you are in sectors that rely on social interaction, the hit to your revenues are off the charts. I mean, it's not something you can look at in the previous data points to see it. And so, we'd have to see how much of this activity comes back. We have to figure out how this particular crisis has, what kind of behavioral impact it has, and how much people want to go out and interact and spend on the kinds of things that they did, tourism, hospitality, and how much they will engage in. So that is unclear. But I think that this is a crisis that requires a lot of support. Like I said, the moral hazard problems are just are minimal at this point in time. So a lot of support is required. When we come out of this, we will have a situation, and this is true globally, where you will have much more impaired private sector balance sheets and public sector balance sheets. So there will be a time of rebuilding and reconstruction. And that's, I think, will be an issue that governments around the world will have to grapple with.
How will this impact employment and labor? We already saw a great movement towards automation, robotics, the use of artificial intelligence technologies. Now there's also the hygiene and sanitation aspect. Will this accelerate, in your view? To what extent will it accelerate the move towards not wanting individuals working on manufacturing products?
I don't really see that as being a major factor in consideration. I don't, this crisis has taught the world how to deal with a pandemic, which means we will be better prepared the next time round. It also means that we will better prepare in anticipation of the next time round. And so, I don't think of this as being some sort of a permanent existential state where this will be such a major factor for decisions about automation.
What are the lessons you think global economies and companies should be learning to be better prepared for the next time round?
I think I would start with saying that countries that don't have a very strong health systems should invest in that. I think that's needed regardless. But this crisis has just highlighted the importance of it. That's one. The second is its importance of having strong social safety nets, which can be, triggered automatically in the sense that countries that have very strong unemployment insurance schemes that can provide cash transfers much more quickly, those are the ones that are able to respond to the needs much faster. And I can see a world where everybody goes more towards this kind of automatic transfer systems, what we call automatic stabilizers. And there will be a situation where governments and private sector, like I talk about, will have to deal with impaired balance sheets. That's another point. And then the last is on international cooperation. I think this crisis has just highlighted even more the need for working closely together and supporting each other through the right amount of financing and the right amount of technical assistance and knowledge sharing. And those are practices that I think will continue.
On a more personal note, Dr. Gopinath,
Rahul,
how are friends and family doing? I hope you've been well. I hope you've been well. How have the last few weeks been for you all, modeling and macroeconomics aside? How have the last few weeks been? I hope your friends and family here and elsewhere are doing all right.
Yes, thankfully, they are doing very well. And thank you for asking.
Stay well, stay safe. For joining us on this special broadcast from Washington, D.C., Dr. Gita Gopinath, thank you very much. Pleasure as always chatting with you. That's the Chief Economist of the International Monetary Fund, Dr. Gita Gopinath, sharing her view on how to bounce back from this COVID-induced coma. I hope you enjoyed that conversation and the insights that Dr. Gopinath